Tonight, we drift back to a time when wigs were powdered, revolutions were whispered in taverns, and helping your rebellious neighbor overthrow an empire seemed like a fashionable diplomatic gamble. You're sitting on the edge of a carved wooden chair in an 18th century salon in Paris. Candlelight dances off silver snuff boxes, perfume clings thick in the air, and somewhere between the clink of wine glasses and the rustle of silk skirts, a few powerful Frenchmen are deciding whether to quietly fuel a colonial uprising across the sea, a war the French aren't even officially in yet. Oh, and by the way, the whole plan might bankrupt their country. So, yes, sit back, relax, and remember you probably wouldn't survive 1776 diplomacy. Not unless you had a liver of iron, a powdered face, and a solid understanding of secret shipping routes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, post your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean against the railing of a creaking merchant ship. It's the 1770s and you're not supposed to be here. This vessel, trimmed in dull brass sails heavy with salt, isn't carrying sugar or wine or decorative clocks to the Americas. No, hidden beneath sacks of grain and barrels of Madeira lie crates of muskets, powder tents, and enough gunflints to outfit a revolution. The French government, still officially at peace with Britain, is playing a double game, publicly neutral, privately meddling. And while King Louis XVI dithers in Versailles over powdered wigs and celestial globes, his ministers are quietly arranging a flow of arms to those loud, liberty-loving rebels across the Atlantic. But don't imagine this all came from nowhere. France had scores to settle. After being thoroughly embarrassed in the 7 Years' War, losing most of its North American holdings, thank you very much, France was itching for payback. The British had taken Canada, pushed French influence out of India, and generally rubbed salt in the wounds of French pride. Supporting the American Revolution wasn't just an act of Enlightenment idealism, it was also good old-fashioned revenge, wrapped in Enlightenment parchment and tied with a bow of philosophical righteousness. Now picture this: French ports like Bordeaux and Nantes bustle with a new kind of trade, not just wine and lace, but contraband cannons bartered through shadowy channels. The Comte de Vergennes, France's foreign minister, played puppet master. He winked at neutrality while dispatching secret envoys. The goal wasn't war, not yet, just a little help, a little destabilization, a little debt creation. Let Britain bleed and let someone else do the bleeding. And so France gave birth to a front company, yes, a literal shell corporation called Rodrigue Hortales and Company. Behind its corporate-sounding name hid something closer to a spy ring crossed with a gun-running operation. Run by a flamboyant playwright/dealer, you'll meet soon, it laundered funds from the crown-sourced weapons from across Europe and slipped them across the Atlantic. This was, historians argue, one of the earliest examples of a state using plausible deniability to wage proxy war. Others still debate whether the king understood the full extent of what was being done in his name, or whether he simply preferred not to ask. Now back to the docks. The crates are loaded, the ships creak out of harbour. Somewhere on the horizon, colonial troops, scrappy, under-equipped, and in desperate need of French gunpowder, are about to find that reinforcements don't always come in uniform. Sometimes they come in wine barrels. And yes, France is risking a lot. Smuggling military aid to a rebel colony across the sea might not sound like a big deal, but it meant crossing Britain, and that meant poking the lion in its sleep while still dressed in velvet slippers. But velvet slippers have surprisingly sharp toes, you'll see. Now you find yourself stepping through the side door of a Parisian theatre, not for a play, but for a deal. The man waiting behind the curtain isn't just any playwright. He's Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, best known in popular circles for writing The Barber of Seville and The Marriage of Figaro, yes, those Figaros. But tonight there are no wigs or witty servants. only ledgers, shipping schedules, and a stack of unsigned invoices tucked into a violin case. Because Beaumarchais, for all his flair with dialogue, had found an even more dramatic calling: international arms smuggling. Let's not pretend he was subtle. Beaumarchais was drama in breeches, sharp-tongued, scandal-prone, and always skating on the edge of disgrace. He had previously tangled with the French court over inheritance rights, been imprisoned, pardoned, exiled, and reinstated several times, in fact. So naturally, when France needed someone expendable but charismatic to funnel aid to the American colonies, without officially implicating the crown, Beaumarchais volunteered with theatrical gusto. He founded Roderigue Hortelez and Company, the world's most baroque front operation. The company was designed to appear as a private enterprise, but in truth, it was fed by millions of livres from the French and Spanish governments, both eager to undercut British global dominance. Beaumarchais coordinated purchases of muskets from Prussia, gunpowder from the Netherlands, and uniforms from local tailors, then shipped them across the Atlantic to General Washington's ragtag army, sometimes disguising the crates as agricultural equipment or church donations. Now imagine him hunched over his desk, candle wax dribbling across a coded manifest. He's composing letters in a flourish of ink and dramatic size, one moment to Washington, the next to the French court, then to Spanish merchants who need coaxing with promises of repayment that may or may not be honored. The man is multitasking like a caffeinated squirrel, except instead of nuts, he's juggling 3 monarchies and a revolution. Was he paid for his efforts? That's the hilarious part, sort of. Congress sent warm thank you letters, then mostly ghosted him. Years later, Beaumarchais would spend the better part of his life and considerable fortune trying to collect reimbursement for services rendered. His descendants were still chasing the American government for money decades after the ink dried on the Treaty of Paris. Historians still debate how central Beaumarchais truly was. Some say his supplies were pivotal in the war's early days, especially the shipment that helped arm American forces before Saratoga. Others argue his role has been romanticized, exaggerated by his own memoirs and a public eager for dashing side characters. But whether hero or hustler, or both, Beaumarchais played his part with operatic flair. And make no mistake, it was risky. British spies knew something was afoot. Ships leaving French ports were sometimes seized and the paperwork cooked, as it was rarely fooled anyone for long. But France's plausible deniability held for a while. When Parliament complained, French diplomats shrugged with the same innocent expression you give when your neighbor asks if that barbecue smell came from your balcony. All this cloak and dagger work set the stage for more open intervention. Beaumarchais helped prove that the Americans were serious, that they could hold a line against the British, and most importantly, that they were worth backing. And that's what the French court needed: a compelling script, something stirring enough to justify open war and the massive cost that would come with it. So the playwright wrote one. Not just on stage, but across oceans. And as the gunpowder flowed west and British merchants started filing complaints, France inched closer to taking off its mask and stepping into the fight in full regalia. You might be tempted to think Beaumarchais got a statue or a grand pension, but no, he got lawsuits, decades of them. He did, however, get remembered by history buffs and slightly smug historians who enjoy pointing out that one of the American Revolution's most valuable supporters was best known for writing a comedy about a barber who helps a man steal his own wife. The Revolution, it turns out, had many barbers, some with guns. You're standing on the polished stone steps of a lavish French estate, but you're not here for wine or gossip. You're watching a teenager, barely out of boarding school, stride purposefully toward a waiting ship. His name is Gilbert du Motier, but history remembers him better as the Marquis de Lafayette. He's 19 years old, fabulously rich, and quite convinced that liberty is more fashionable than lace. Against the wishes of his king, his family, and nearly every adult in his life, Lafayette is about to run off and join a revolution in a country he's never seen, because that's what idealistic nobles did in the 1770s, apparently. He pays for his own ship. Seriously, when the French military tells him no, he shrugs, hires a crew, and buys a vessel. It's like if a modern teenager, banned from flying to a war zone, just said cool and purchased a private jet. But Lafayette isn't just playing soldier. He wants to mean something. Raised on Enlightenment philosophy and dreams of glory, he believes in the American cause, or at least the version he's read in dispatches and romantic novels. When he arrives in America in 1777, the Continental Congress doesn't know what to do with him. He speaks no English, has no battlefield experience, and keeps bowing awkwardly to everyone like it's Versailles. But Washington takes a liking to him. There's something sincere about this gangly French aristocrat with soft hands and a burning desire to bleed for freedom. They form a bond that's part mentorship, part bromance, and fully strategic. Lafayette becomes a vital link between American leadership and French aid. But don't be fooled by the powdered cheeks. Lafayette fights. He's wounded in the Battle of Brandywine. He holds the line at Monmouth. He rides into skirmishes like a man trying to prove not just courage, but relevance. His letters back to France are laced with urgency. America needs help, real help. Troops, ships, money. His name, now tied to the revolution, carries weight in court circles. Eventually, his lobbying helps tip the balance toward full French intervention. Historians still argue whether Lafayette was more symbol than strategist. Some point out that others did more with less fanfare. Others insist he was the essential bridge between two revolutions. Either way, his image, sword-drawn tricolour fluttering, was irresistible. Americans named towns after him. Frenchmen whispered about him in salons. He became the living embodiment of the Atlantic Alliance before anyone had coined that term. There's a quirky detail here too. Lafayette named his son George Washington Lafayette. Yes, really. A French noble named his heir after the American general. It's like naming your child after your favorite podcast host if that podcast had also saved your life in a trench. When Lafayette returned to France for a time during the war, it wasn't to rest, it was to advocate harder. He begged his government for more troops, more ships, more anything. And somehow, the boy who defied the king became one of the reasons the king finally said, "Fine, let's join the war." You can almost hear the clink of his sword as he strides through muddy American camps, teaching soldiers how to dig proper trenches while explaining the finer points of French artillery. His manners sometimes grated, his uniforms were often too crisp, but his heart was undeniably in the right place. Years later, when revolutions came for France itself, Lafayette would find himself in a much darker chapter. But for now, in 1778, under the canvas of an American tent, he is the revolution's golden boy, the teenager who ran toward gunfire and found his destiny in another country's cause. So yes, remember him when you next pass Lafayette, Louisiana, or Lafayette, Indiana, or Fayetteville, North Carolina, or any of the dozen other places bearing his name. Not bad for a teenager with a yacht. Now the boots you hear squelching through the Chesapeake mud aren't colonial. They're polished, regulation-issue French leather. You blink against the late summer light as a line of crisp, powdered officers steps off a transport ship and unfurls the white Bourbon flag. After years of secret shipments and shadowy sympathies, France is finally in the war, and they've brought actual professionals. Enter Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, French noble career general, and the calm, reluctant grown-up to America's gang of upstart rebels. Rochambeau didn't storm into the conflict with Lafayette's youthful fire. He was nearly twice the Marquis's age and far more experienced. When Louis XV tapped him to lead 7,000 French troops to support the Americans, Rochambeau winced, partly because he knew the risks and partly because he doubted the Americans would know which end of a bayonet to hold. But orders were orders, and soon the Comte was on a boat preparing to camp in the wilds of Rhode Island, beside rebels who thought drill meant digging latrines. It didn't start smoothly. Rochambeau's troops arrived in 1780 and promptly waited for months. The Americans didn't have the supplies to move them. The British loomed nearby, and Washington was skeptical. Would the French act in good faith? Could these European officers actually take orders from scrappy, underpaid rebels with questionable hygiene? It turns out yes. Eventually. The two sides learned to cooperate not easily, but with mutual necessity. And if you close your eyes, you can hear the odd rhythms of their uneasy alliance fife and drum, from the Americans' brass horns and formal marches, from the French dinner tents, filled with awkward silences and polite nods over wildly different menus. French officers, reportedly appalled by American cuisine, sometimes brought their own chefs to war, because of course they did. One quirky anecdote survives from these early months. French troops were said to have distributed fine wine to American allies, much to the locals' delight and eventual regret, once hangovers set in with the brutal regularity of musket drills. And yet, despite language barriers, snobbery, and incompatible uniforms, something worked. Washington and Rochambeau built a cautious respect. They planned together, drilled side by side, and began to imagine an end to this war. Historians still debate the full impact of Rochambeau's presence. Some argue that French troops gave a crucial morale boost and strategic edge. Others suggest the Americans could have won eventually anyway, though it might have taken far longer and cost far more. What's certain is the professionalism and discipline of Rochambeau's forces gave the Continental Army something to lean on, literally. They had better tents. And remember this, France didn't just send men. They sent engineers, sappers, cavalry surgeons, paymasters, and cartographers. This was no token force, it was an expeditionary army, and it came with heavy expectations. France wanted victory, not a messy stalemate, not a half-peace, a clean British defeat, preferably one with pageantry. So when Rochambeau and Washington finally met in person in a series of quiet planning sessions over tobacco and cider, they began sketching what would become one of the most elegant traps in military history. But first they had to get moving, across rivers, down the eastern seaboard, through humid valleys and skeptical towns. French soldiers were jeered in some villages and toasted in others. American farmers sometimes mistook them for Hessians, German mercenaries hired by the British until corrected, usually with flamboyant bowing and the waving of tricolour sashes. And yet by late 1781 this odd couple of revolution had learned to march in step. You can almost hear it now, the rhythmic stomp of French boots beside worn American shoes, moving toward a town in Virginia where the final act would unfold. But don't get there just yet. For now, picture a smoky evening in a shared camp. Washington and Rochambeau are poring over maps by lamplight. Somewhere outside, Lafayette is enthusiastically lecturing a group of soldiers in half French, half English, and the stars above hang heavy with anticipation. The air is thick with heat and the smell of damp earth as you trudge through the fields of Yorktown, Virginia. It's September 1781 and every footstep feels like history creaking under your boots. You're part of something monumental now, something you might not survive but which your grandchildren will never stop hearing about. Ahead, the British are entrenched under General Cornwallis, their cannons buried deep behind earthworks, their red uniforms fading under the southern sun. Behind you, two armies, one ragged and one regal, have finally converged with purpose. And above it all, the French Navy has arrived. The Battle of Yorktown is the moment when France's gamble pays off. And it's not just troops on the ground, though Rochambeau's soldiers are everywhere, their crisp uniforms now smudged with Virginia dust. It's the fleet. France has brought ships, big ones, with cannons, dozens of them. Admiral de Grasse has sailed up from the Caribbean with 29 ships of the line and dropped anchor at the mouth of the Chesapeake, cutting off any hope Cornwallis had of escape by sea. The French blockade is silent, unmoving, like a wall of oak and iron across the water. Historians agree this blockade was the decisive move. Without it, British ships could have plucked Cornwallis to safety, and this whole business might have dragged on for another 10 bloody years. Instead, the trap snaps shut. The Americans and French press, from land, digging trenches and launching bombardments day and night, while the British stare out at an ocean they no longer control. Picture the scene. You're in the American trenches, mud up to your shins. French engineers, yes, France brought those too, are showing you how to dig zigzagging saps, how to build fascines from bundled sticks, how to place your cannon so it doesn't overheat and crack after 3 shots. There's camaraderie in bursts. The Americans admire the French artillery. The French somewhat condescendingly admire the Americans' willingness to eat hardtack and bark if necessary. One quirky detail. During the siege, French soldiers reportedly played music at night. Some even danced on occasion as though to mock the stillness of their enemy. It's said that one tune they favoured was a minuet, a graceful, courtly relic of Versailles performed in earshot of starving British troops trying to stay awake in their trenches. That, my friend, is psychological warfare à la mode. But don't be fooled. The siege is brutal. Day after day, shells explode in parabolic arcs. Cannons thunder across the field. Men die, and still Cornwallis does not surrender. Not yet. Then comes October 14th. A coordinated assault on British redoubts, those stubborn earthen forts led by American and French troops. Alexander Hamilton takes one, the French take the other. The path to the heart of the British line is cracked wide open. Now you hear the faint groan of British horns as the white flags begin to flutter. On October 19th, Cornwallis surrenders his entire army, over 7,000 troops. He claims to be ill and refuses to appear in person. His second-in-command tries to surrender to Rochambeau. The French general, in a moment of sly dignity, points to George Washington. "Monsieur," he says, "you should give your sword to the man whose rebellion you tried to crush. It's over." The war is not officially done, but this is the blow from which Britain will not recover. French cannons made the difference. French ships closed the trap. French blood is in the soil of Virginia. And now comes the bill. Historians still debate whether Yorktown could have been won without French help. Some argue the Americans would have held out, found new allies, or outlasted the British with sheer stubbornness. But most agree without the French navy, without Rochambeau, without those sleek ships blocking the Chesapeake, Cornwallis would have slipped away, and the war would have ground on. Tonight, as you sit by the fire and listen to the distant toll of church bells in a town where revolution just became real, you don't yet know what this victory cost, not just in lives or musket balls, but in loans, in interest rates, in favours owed. The United States has won the war, but France has won a receipt, a long, expensive, increasingly awkward receipt. You're walking through the marble halls of Versailles now, and the victory at Yorktown is being toasted with crystal goblets and sly, knowing glances. The nobles sip champagne, ministers preen by the fountains, and someone whispers to the king that the Americans have done it, they've defeated the British. The court erupts in elegant glee. France has struck back at its old enemy and won. But under the perfume and powdered wigs, something else is rising, a whiff of panic, faint but growing. Because, while the revolution across the sea is a political triumph, the numbers are dreadful. France didn't just send a few crates of muskets. By the time Yorktown falls, the French crown has spent the equivalent of over 1.3 billion livres, an astronomical sum. They've funded ships, soldiers' ports, and more diplomatic dinners than you'd think a war could require. They paid salaries, bought powder, and covered expenses for an army operating on another continent. And unlike the Americans, who printed paper money like it was going out of style, spoiler, it was France, had creditors, angry ones. The war wasn't just a geopolitical maneuver, it was a financial body blow. Now the cracks begin to show. Versailles is lavish as ever, but Treasury officials are whispering in corners, quills scratching furiously over columns of numbers that don't add up. The king's ministers beg him to raise taxes on the nobility. He declines. Then they suggest taxing the clergy. Another shrug. Desperate for revenue, the monarchy does what every desperate regime does, borrows more. And here comes the quirky twist: France never really got paid back. The American Congress broke, and squabbling sent heartfelt thanks and a trickle of silver. Beaumarchais remember him, still trying to collect. By 1783, France had helped win the revolution and inherited a financial crisis. Historians still argue whether this debt directly caused the French Revolution. Some say it merely accelerated a collapse that was already underway, sparked by structural inequality, outdated institutions, and a monarchy allergic to reform. Others argue that helping the Americans lit the fuse, that the king's reckless generosity abroad forced painful austerity at home, drying up credit and pushing ordinary people to the brink. The evidence piles up like unpaid bills. Peasants groan under rising bread prices. Urban workers riot over wages. The nobility shrinks from responsibility, convinced their birthright is eternal. Meanwhile, the king still spends lavishly on theatres, gardens, and his pet projects involving giant mechanical bird cages. And yes, that last one is real. By 1786, the French state is spending more each year on interest payments than on its military. That's right, the kingdom that helped topple the world's greatest empire is now shackled to loan repayments. The war that made America free has made France fragile, and yet, in the salons of Paris, some still speak of it as a glorious chapter. They raise glasses to liberty, thrilled by the poetry of revolution, as long as it stays far away. But the ideas are spreading. American envoys linger in towns, squares, telling eager French listeners about constitutions, elected assemblies, and citizens' rights. The ink on the Declaration of Independence is still wet, but its echoes are rattling palace windows. And so France, the kingdom that bankrolled rebellion, now faces something it didn't quite expect: revolution at home. Not in uniform, not yet, but in pamphlets, in slogans, in whispers that grow louder every day. You pass a bureaucrat in Versailles who mutters about reforms. You hear a merchant in Lyon grumble about taxes. You see a farmer count coins and realize he won't eat meat this winter. And you lucky sleeper know what's coming. Because when a nation sells its jewels to fund someone else's freedom, the final cost isn't always in coin. You're following the aroma of fresh bread through the cobbled streets of Paris now, except wait, there isn't any. The baker's stalls are empty, the queues are long, and tempers are shorter than a powdered wig on a humid day. It's the late 1780s, and the kingdom that once paraded around in gold-embroidered uniforms is teetering. The debt from the American Revolution has drained the treasury. Food prices are spiking, wages are stagnant, and the people, they're hungry, cold, and dangerously unimpressed with monarchy. This is the part where a cake gets involved. Marie Antoinette, France's not-quite beloved queen, is often remembered for one icy sentence: "Let them eat cake." Did she say it? Historians still argue. Most think she didn't. It first appeared in Rousseau's writings when Marie was still a child, but it stuck to her like flour on an apron, partly because it felt true. To the angry masses, she symbolized everything that was wrong with the aristocracy, distant, decadent, and dripping in diamonds while peasants boiled grass for dinner. And the numbers don't lie. By 1789, France's national debt had reached crisis levels. Over half of the government's revenue was being used to pay interest on loans. Remember the warships at Yorktown, the cannonades, the uniforms, all of it paid on credit. And now the crown needed to refill its coffers, so it turned to taxes, except the rich still weren't paying them. France's tax system was a masterpiece of inequality. The first estate clergy and second estate nobility enjoyed exemptions. The burden fell on the third estate, everyone else: merchants, peasants, labourers, and even the petite bourgeoisie. These people, many of whom had cheered the American cause just a decade earlier, now looked at Versailles and saw not enlightenment, but entitlement. They'd helped finance someone else's revolution. Maybe it was time for their own. And here's where the quirky turns into the catastrophic. To address the crisis, Louis XVI convened the Estates General and National Assembly that hadn't met in 175 years. It was meant to solve problems. Instead, it gave voice to rage. The Third Estate broke off, declared itself the National Assembly, and took the tennis court oath, swearing not to disband until they'd written a constitution. From there, things unravelled faster than a powdered wig in a thunderstorm. July 14th, 1789, the Bastille falls. The monarchy begins to crumble. And suddenly the Americans aren't just friends from a previous war, they're the ghost in the mirror. French revolutionaries looked to Washington, to Jefferson, to those noble-sounding declarations across the sea. Liberty, equality, brotherhood. It's all very inspiring until it isn't. Because while Americans secured independence, France descended into chaos. Heads rolled literally. The guillotine became the centerpiece of Parisian justice. Lafayette. Yes, that Lafayette tried to guide the revolution peacefully, but was soon caught between royalists and radicals. He fled. Marie Antoinette lost her crown, her dignity, and finally, her head. And Louis XVI, who had once bankrolled America's freedom in hopes of restoring French prestige, ended up on the scaffold a monarch undone by the very ideals he'd once helped export. Historians still wrestle with the irony. Did the support of the American Revolution directly lead to the French one? Maybe not directly, but like a pebble tossed into a very expensive fountain, the ripples spread. France's attempt to weaken Britain ended up weakening itself. It funded freedom abroad and sparked rebellion at home. The revolution was contagious. And here's a detail you might not hear in school. One of the first things American diplomats did after the French Revolution began was to panic. Jefferson, then in Paris, loved the ideas but feared the violence. He had to balance sympathy with self-preservation, all while writing flowery letters about Republican virtue. There's a moment, reportedly, when he watched a mob march past his window and simply closed the shutters. So next time you see an American celebrating July 4th or a French friend raising a glass on Bastille Day, remember one revolution borrowed the other's shoes and then promptly ran off a cliff in them. The air in Paris smells different now, less like fresh pastries and powdered wigs, more like tension ink and singed wood. You're strolling past shuttered shops and newspapers pasted to crumbling walls. It's the early 1790s and the city is alive with the clamour of revolution. But you're not just any wanderer. You're walking with Thomas Jefferson, America's ambassador to France, reluctant diplomat, quiet note-taker, and the only man in the city trying to look calm in a silk waistcoat while everything burns down around him. Jefferson arrived in France in 1784, fresh from the glow of American independence, carrying with him a love of Enlightenment ideas and a slightly awkward French vocabulary. At first it was exhilarating. He mingled with philosophers, toured the countryside, and admired French art, architecture, and science. He wrote admiring letters about French cuisine, especially wine, and even brought home recipes. For a time, Paris felt like an extension of Philadelphia, just with better furniture. But now the optimism curdles. The revolution he once viewed as a necessary political evolution is rapidly morphing into something darker. As mobs storm palaces and heads tumble into baskets, Jefferson keeps one hand on his quill and the other on his packed suitcase. He attends salons in the evening, listens to heated debates about liberty and sovereignty, and returns home to candlelit journals filled with ambivalence. Historians still argue how Jefferson truly felt. Some say he remained sympathetic to the French cause until the Reign of Terror made it untenable. Others believe he grew cautious much earlier, worried that the American experiment might be tainted by association. What's clear is that Jefferson walked a diplomatic tightrope, cheering on liberty in theory while quietly recoiling from the chaos playing out on the cobblestones below. And here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Jefferson was a fan of French peas, truly. He had seeds sent back to Monticello and tried to cultivate them on his plantation. Somewhere between writing treatises on liberty and exchanging letters with Madison, he was also obsessing over legumes. Because even during revolutions, a man has to eat. Back in Paris, Jefferson observed as Lafayette, his dear friend and former comrade, was increasingly squeezed between radicals and royalists. Lafayette tried to uphold a constitutional monarchy, a kind of moderate Enlightenment dream. But moderation wasn't in fashion. Robespierre was rising. Guillotines were clanking. The centre could no longer hold. And yet, even as the blood flowed in the Place de la Révolution, the memory of America lingered. French revolutionaries invoked 1776 as a blueprint even as they rewrote it with sharper edges. Jefferson's very presence became a symbol even if he was too polite to say so. French newspapers printed his thoughts, revolutionaries cited his letters. His quiet demeanor masked the fact that he was inadvertently one of the most influential men in France, not because he spoke loudly, but because his country had done it first. Of course, Jefferson had his contradictions. He preached liberty while owning slaves. He admired equality but preferred property-owning elites. He smiled at French revolutionaries while inching ever closer to the exit. Diplomacy, after all, often smells like hypocrisy with a spritz of lavender. And when his time in France ended, Jefferson left with mixed feelings. He'd witnessed the beginnings of two revolutions, one that birthed a new nation and one that would soon devour its own creators. He carried back gifts, manuscripts, and an even deeper commitment to Enlightenment principles, but perhaps also a hint of dread. If revolution could turn that fast in Paris, could it not do the same in Philadelphia? So, as he boarded his ship home, the harbor behind him flickering with torchlight, Jefferson did not celebrate. He pondered, he worried, he probably took a few French peas with him. And America, meanwhile, still hadn't settled the tab. You now drift south far from Paris and its cobblestone guillotines to the sultry, sugar-slick ports of the Caribbean and the polished war rooms of Europe. It's the early 1800s, and France, having guillotined its king, overthrown its monarchy, and attempted to reinvent its calendar, is now consolidating. But not gently. Because into this fractured scene rides a man with short stature, long ambitions, and a hat shaped like an omelette, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon didn't care much for powdered wigs or powdered manners. He cared about maps, specifically how to redraw them with France on top. The revolution was over. Technically, the monarchy was gone for now, and the republic had become an empire with Napoleon at its center, crowned by his own hand in 1804. And like any ruler with debts and dreams, he started liquidating. Which brings us to one of history's strangest real estate transactions, the Louisiana Purchase. You're standing now in a musty Parisian office. The wallpaper is peeling. The diplomat from America is sweating. And Napoleon is signing away 828,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River for just $15 million. It's 1803, and Thomas Jefferson, now president, is buying land so vast and so vaguely defined that even cartographers have no idea what's in it. Swamps, buffalo future, jazz festivals, no one's quite sure. But why did Napoleon sell? Historians still debate this. Some argue he was spooked by the loss of Haiti, France's richest colony, which had just fought off his army and declared independence. Others believe he simply needed the cash to fund his European campaigns, and still others point to a pile of unpaid bills from a certain revolution across the Atlantic and a desire to close the ledger. One thing is clear, France was done with its American experiment. The land had become more liability than asset. And here's your fringe fact cherry: part of the money used to buy Louisiana was borrowed from British banks. Yes, the same Britain that America had fought in its War of Independence helped finance America's biggest land deal with the country that helped them win it. Because history, like revolutions, loves irony. Napoleon, for all his megalomania, recognized a bad investment when he saw one. The Louisiana Territory wasn't just underdefended, it was nearly undefendable. After losing Haiti, he realized he couldn't build a Caribbean to North America empire, so he sold it fast and cheap, at roughly 4 cents per acre. A decision that ironically helped the United States rise into the continental power that would later oppose him. And Jefferson. He signed the deal with a mix of triumph and constitutional guilt. After all, there was nothing in the US Constitution about buying half a continent, but when opportunity knocks and offers you farmland stretching to the Rockies, you let it in. And offer it tea. This purchase doubled the size of the US, changed its destiny, and subtly finalized something left hanging. Since 1783, it was a full-circle moment. France had helped birth the United States, nearly bankrupted itself doing so, then years later sold it land to stay afloat. It's as if the friendship between the two countries had turned into a yard sale. But France wasn't sentimental. By the time Napoleon turned his armies toward Russia and Spain, America was little more than a distant thought. The revolution it helped start had long since stopped returning calls. Still, the echoes remained. French names dotted the Mississippi. Lafayette's shadow lingered in textbooks, and every time an American surveyed the vast western plains, they were walking across soil that had once been traded in a fit of imperial fatigue. So tonight, as Napoleon sharpens his ambitions in a candlelit tent and Jefferson plants French peas in Virginia, remember, not all revolutions end in treaties. Some end in auctions. You're back now on American soil, standing at the base of a statue. It's Lafayette again. Bronze-cast, sword-raised gaze, fixed on an eternal battlefield that no longer exists. This one happens to be in Washington, D.C., but there are others in New York, in Baltimore, in Paris, even in tiny towns where his boots never stepped. He's everywhere. Because somewhere along the way, the memory of France's help in the American Revolution became part of the national mythology. Romantic, selective, and just a little fuzzy around the financial edges. You tilt your head upward and wonder, did America ever really repay France? The answer is complicated. After the Revolution, the United States promised to honor its debts. And, to its credit, it tried. Some payments were made. Bonds were issued. But war broke out between France and Britain again, and the US declared neutrality. The French felt betrayed. Treaties were questioned, and by the late 1790s the two supposed allies were pointing cannons at each other's ships in what historians now call the quasi-war. Yes, after all that powdered wig camaraderie, France and America nearly came to blows over unpaid bills, mutual suspicion, and the lingering fog of revolutionary diplomacy. Jefferson, now president, tried to mend things, so did others. There were new agreements, new ambassadors, and new debts. Meanwhile, the American public conveniently forgot just how dire things had been without French aid. The myth grew taller than the statues, scrappy America defeating the British Empire all on its own. And so sure they helped. A bit, maybe. There was a ship or two. Historians still argue about the long-term impact of France's assistance. Some believe the alliance was a true partnership, a meeting of minds sparked by Enlightenment ideals. Others insist it was pure geopolitics. France wanted to hurt Britain and saw an opportunity. Either way, the cost was steep. Financially, socially, politically, France paid dearly. The American cause may have inspired the French Revolution, but it also destabilized a monarchy, upended Europe, and changed global power balances for a century. And the receipts, they came in slow. Beaumarchais' descendants kept suing. France's post-revolutionary governments tried to renegotiate. Occasionally, America sent shipments of flour or made symbolic gestures, but the full balance of blood treasure and trust remained murky. Friendships forged in war often are. Here's a quirky final flourish. In 1824, Lafayette returned to America as the nation's guest. He was old now, the last surviving major general of the Revolution. He toured the country, embraced veterans, gave speeches. Crowds wept. Cities renamed themselves in his honor. He rode in carriages pulled by white horses, kissed babies, and took part in parades that lasted for hours. America, by then nearly 50 years old, was throwing a thank-you party long overdue. But deep down there was also guilt. This man had risked everything for their freedom. His homeland had collapsed, rebuilt, and collapsed again. And yet he came not to demand money or restitution, but to celebrate a revolution he helped win. Maybe, just maybe, that parade was the interest payment. And now, with the torch of history dimming to a flicker, you step back. You hear the creak of wagons, the murmur of soldiers, the lapping of waves in distant harbors where tricolor flags once rose in defiance. You see two nations, one young and eager, the other older and proud, locked in a strange embrace of ideals and invoices. Because revolutions don't run on liberty alone. Someone always picks up the tab. And so the embers of revolution dim behind your eyelids, the ships are docked, the drums are silent, the muskets are stacked beside cracked stone walls now overgrown with ivy. What was once a clamor of war and alliance has become a quiet memory, one laced with cannons, courtrooms, and just a hint of unpaid interest. Let your breath slow now. Let your thoughts drift from the powdered courtiers of Versailles to the candlelit tents in Virginia. From silken maps stretched across oak tables to the soft rustle of treaties folded in trembling hands. The noise of history is quieter in the dark. Just footsteps in snow, sails in the wind pens scratching on parchment. The bond between France and America was never perfect, but it was bold, it was costly, and it was very, very real. It built a country. And then far away, it helped unmake a monarchy. Two revolutions dancing years apart but forever stepping to the same uncertain rhythm. So rest now beneath the gaze of statues and the hush of old letters. Let Lafayette ride once more through cobbled streets in your dreams. Let Jefferson stare out a Parisian window, puzzled and proud. Let Beaumarchais finally cash his check. The debts of history may never be settled in full, but their stories keep us company even in the stillness of night. Sleep well, dream deep,